sorry it took a few minutes. Traffic in Ridgefield is horrific today, apparently. I wonder why. It has something to do with, oh, it's not that bad. That's Rudy. Good afternoon. My name is Susan Coco, and I welcome you to the first of our Advancing the Dialogue Forum series of 2017. This series was begun in 2003 from the point of view that we believe here in Ridgefield that the most important political and community issues of the day must be discussed and made accessible at the grassroots level. This forum is sponsored by the Democratic Town Committee. However, it is a nonpartisan forum. So you will hear our speakers, who I will introduce in a moment, speak very knowledgeably and very comprehensively in a way which is designed to illuminate the issues and cause you to think and ask questions. Our format today will be as follows. I'll introduce our gentleman. Scott Bates will speak first. He will then be followed by Congressman Jim Himes. As the moderator, I have a question for each of them, which I will ask at the end of their presentation, and then we will open questions to the floor. There are ushers, and can we get the ushers to come forward, because they can't see you back there. We have two ushers. A gentleman at the front, can you come up a little further? A lady, young woman in the back, each of whom have microphones. And when you are called on, I will call on speakers. When you are called on, please, you see a person with a microphone, we ask that you not make a speech, but that you, please don't, but that you also ask a question, because we have a limited amount of time today, and I know there's going to be a lot of dialogue and a lot of interest in this subject. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers of the day, and I'm going to begin with Scott Bates. Scott Bates may not be familiar to many of you here in Ridgefield, but he is currently the Deputy Secretary of the State of Connecticut. That is simply one post in a very long career of public service. Scott is an attorney. He has served in Virginia. He has been on the ground in every war zone where American troops have fought in this generation. One of his specialties is encouraging the development of democratic institutions and encouraging the development of fair and open elections in places around the world such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Bosnia, Haiti, and the Persian Gulf. Most notably, after September 11th, Scott became the first senior policy advisor to the United States House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee. Now just think about that. It was immediately after 9/11, and he was the principal author of Winning the War on Terror, which helped to inform the 9/11 Commission hearings. Scott will be our first speaker. Before we begin, however, I'd like to introduce someone who you probably all do know, which is our Congressman Jim Himes. Congressman Himes was elected in 2008 and began serving in January of 2009. He clearly represents the 4th Congressional District, which is the district in which Ridgefield resides, along with our sister towns from Stamford to Bridgeport, Norwalk, Wilton, and others across the state. Jim has the distinction of serving as the ranking member of the NSA and Cybersecurity Subcommittee of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and that's a mouthful. He is clearly incredibly informed and is a first-hand participant in the House hearings on subjects related to the questions that are currently dominating the daily news, from Russian hacking to investigations to all of the communication that we have now seen about terrorism and counterterrorism. Jim is really not only our representative in Congress, he's a first-hand witness to what many really believe is now a pivotal issue and will continue to be a pivotal area of concern for our country for many years going forward. Before we begin, I would also like to recognize all of you that have come out today. This was a very, very hot ticket. So, but free, not like trying to see Bette Midler. But it was a very hot ticket, and it's a lovely Saturday afternoon, the first really great day of the summer. And I really want to compliment you, because there is no substitute for an informed and active community and an informed and active electorate. So we thank you very much. That is the reason why we do this. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize some of our elected officials who are with us today. Rudy Marconi, our first selectman, Dave Ulmer, the chairman of the Board of Finance, Steve Zemo, who is a member of the Board of Selectmen, Michael Taylor, who's a member of our Board of Education. Anyone else that I'm aware of in the back? Sky Cole, what, ZBA? Zoning Board of Appeals. I'm sorry, P&Z? No, ZBA is what I thought it was, ZBA. And Tom Madden, who is the chairperson of the Democratic Town Committee. And with all of that being said, I'd like to begin and have you welcome Scott Bates, our Deputy Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Susan. I am the Deputy Secretary of the State of Connecticut, not like, I have some friends internationally that when they saw me get this new job, and they were like, congratulations, but we're surprised you're working with President Trump. Yeah, that would surprise me too. Thank you to Susan Coco, to Rudy Marconi, and the Ridgefield Democrats for making this gathering possible, and for everyone here, independent, Republican, none of the above, that has come here, 250 people on a beautiful summer day. And I take the responsibility very seriously to have a great conversation on issues of great importance to our nation. And it's an honor to be with Congressman Himes, who's leading the way on so many important issues. So hello to everybody on Facebook Live. Did you know that this is on Facebook Live right now? That means Russian intelligence is listening to it. Hey guys, President Anya? You're laughing, but I'm telling you. Folks, Winston Churchill famously said that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But I don't think it's really that complicated. In fact, if you give me about 10 minutes, which is my time, I'll be happy to try and explain what I think is going on. And I think I'll look at 4 things in particular: where the Russians are coming from, what they want, why we should treat them as a threat, and what we can do to ensure that we can all get along. First, where are the Russians coming from? What's their deal, in short? Well, history is alive to Russians in a way that we can't really understand. There's a history, a 1,000-year history of invasion, humiliation, conquest, and collapse. Having been a people together for millennia, they have a strange mix of deep insecurity and dominance behavior, all in an illusory search for security. In the memory of all Russians is their march across the Eurasian steppes, imperial glory, raising their flag over the Reichstag in World War II, and being a superpower capable of sending the first man into space and dominating Eastern Europe. Also in the Russian national psyche are memories of invasion and humiliation, conquest and enslavement by the Mongols, defeat at the hands of the smaller and more advanced armies of the West over hundreds of years, which included the likes of the Swedes, the Poles, the French, the Germans, and the British. And don't forget American intervention in 1919, because they sure haven't. And in our lifetime, perhaps the greatest humiliation of all, the unraveling of the Soviet Union and the rise of nations independent of Mother Russia. And all those statelets, or states, are beachheads for Western influence, areas of potential instability that could threaten Russian security, and most importantly to them, threaten the Russian regime. America, until recently, I think, has been a pretty optimistic country. Our search for security reflects a history of marching across a continent, protection by 2 oceans, no real threats from neighbors, and an ability to decisively intervene in foreign conflicts and shape the global security environment to our benefit. That's who we've been as a people. But the Russians have always had a pessimistic worldview. They have vast unprotected frontiers that are open to invasion. They have no real allies, and many neighbors resentful of Russian occupation and interference. They see themselves under siege on all fronts, protectors of traditional civilization, and they seek survival strategies that destabilize perceived enemies. So that's where they're coming from, in my estimation. Second, what do the Russians really want? By that, let's say the Russian government and a large portion of their population. It's all about fending off regime change for Putin and his regime. For they see themselves as having a losing hand long-term vis-a-vis the West and China, if things don't change. They want stability for themselves, no more revolutions at home, or in their near abroad, which are all the countries that border them. They want weak neighbors. They want a divided Western world, unable to impose its will on them like it had in the 1990s. They want to defeat the idea that there are universal values, such as human rights and democracy as we think of them in the West, and that these ideas somehow supersede Russian sovereignty in all of their actions. They desperately fear and want to avoid at all costs their disintegration politically. No more collapses like the fall of the Soviet Union, no more republics out of control like Chechnya. For a profoundly insecure power and regime, they want to destabilize all those around them. Third, why treat Russia as a threat? The definition of threat is capability plus intention. What are Russia's capabilities? Remember, Russia does have the military capability to destroy the United States of America by virtue of its nuclear arsenal. Russia has the military capability to threaten, attack, and defeat our European allies unless they received our instant and overwhelming military support. What are their intentions? I'll refer you back to what I've just said about where I think they're coming from. Keep neighbors weak and dependent, divide Western allies, and undermine America's claim for global influence based on support for universal values of human rights and democracy. Judging from the formula that I just pointed out, we should treat Russia as a threat to our security, the security of our allies, and to American interests and our values. Fourth and finally, what can we do to ensure that we can get along with Russia and avoid the kind of conflicts that can lead to war? I think it comes down to one maxim, and you heard it after 9/11, which is united we stand. And that's why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is so important. We're pledged to defend 27 other nations in Europe, and they are pledged to defend us. It's the most successful alliance in history at maintaining the balance of power for 70 years. We have to stand up and speak out about our values. That includes things like the suppression of gay rights inside Russia, the destruction of the freedom of the press, support for political pluralism, and individual civil liberties. Because America is not just another nation on the roll call between Albania and Zaire. We actually stand for something in the eyes of people in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where I've worked for some 15 years. They still believe in us and in our values, and look at that as a way that people ought to be able to govern themselves. And that's a strength. Third, I'd say we have to fight back in cyber, the cyber realm against Russian intrusion, and in the realm of disinformation. I think that this is a tactic called hybrid warfare that the Russians have been, it's part of their military doctrine, is to undermine control of cyber and information. So we have to fight back on that front. And finally, I'd say we have to move forward with confidence here at home. Yeah, we're divided a little bit. Yeah, the economy is only at 2% instead of 4%. On balance, would you ever want to trade with any other country in the world? I wouldn't, coming from a strategic perspective. We need to remember that and walk confidently on the world stage, not arrogantly, but as a leader that has allies. If we become like Putin and his followers, and by that I mean insular, provincial, paranoid, and depressed as a people, then we lose all that gives us an advantage. Our strength is our ideas, our ability to gain allies, and to be seen as caring about more than ourselves. In those things is our ultimate security and best protection against the declining and dangerous power that is Putin's Russia. So those are my thoughts, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Scott, for setting the stage for us, and now would like to welcome Congressman Himes.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Scott, for that terrific summary, and thank you all for being here for what I hope will be a instructive and good conversation. I never would have imagined a year ago that I would sort of be in the process of getting a PhD on national security as it pertains to Russia. I'm supposed to be down there kind of working for infrastructure investment and improved healthcare, all this stuff, but as you might surmise, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, as the second-ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, an awful lot of my attention has moved over to the question of what happened with the Russian hack of our election, and of course the question as to whether there were any U.S. persons or entities who knew of or colluded with that effort. Scott did a wonderful job saying some things that are really important to understand when you're thinking about Russia. The fact that they have legitimate security interests that we probably don't understand. There were roughly 60 million people all in killed in World War II, 20 million. 1 in 3 of the people killed in World War II were Russian. And as Scott said, this is a country that is in many ways the opposite of ours, where they have no natural defenses and just seen invasion after invasion. So they have security interests that they feel intensely that from our perspective, protected by oceans as we are, may look paranoid. But we need to sort of root ourselves in that fact. And then one other fact that Scott teased out a little bit, and I would just emphasize before I get into kind of what happened in the hack of our election and what we might do about it. Scott made the point that they are playing, he said weak hand, a very weak hand, and it's worth emphasizing that. There is no metric but one, and I'm going to put a little asterisk on this and come back to it. There is no metric but one in which they are anywhere close to the United States in terms of strength, power, ability to project power abroad. Their economy is half the size of California's economy. Now, California's a pretty big economy, but Russia's is half the size of the Californian economy. We have 11 active carrier strike groups. These are aircraft carriers. It's basically the ability to park an airport off somebody's coast, and it comes with all sorts of support ships and combat ships. We've got 11 of those nuclear powered. They've got 1 carrier strike group, diesel powered, which doesn't work very well. It's being towed across the Mediterranean more often than doing anything else. So it's important to remember that when we not think in the terms that we used to think about things in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, where we really were co-equal military powers. Now, the asterisk that I do want to come back to, of course, is the one metric on which they match us is that we both have roughly 7,000 nuclear warheads. Whole other conversation about whether there's any sense to anybody having 7,000 nuclear warheads. But that changes the dynamic a little bit. We never want to get to a point of catastrophe where things are not understood, where that becomes relevant. But actually, we've been pretty good at that since the 1950s. We worry much more about loose nukes, a nuclear weapon finding itself in the hands of a rogue non-state actor terrorist, or Pakistan or North Korea, where we don't predict the rules of the game of operating, the game that we're operating in. So that's important to remember, because if you start there, you realize that Vladimir Putin, in trying to achieve the objectives that Scott outlined, and he did it very well, it's about keeping the West unbalanced, it's about keeping NATO away from Russian borders, it's about making us insecure and lacking in confidence and internally focused so that he can operate abroad in the way that is consistent with what he regards a great power. The one thing Scott didn't say that is with respect to their objectives that I would add, I was in Berlin last week at an Aspen Institute funded conference on Russian-US relations, and there were a bunch of Russians there, and for 3 days I listened to them get passionate about the need to be perceived as a great power. And I think this goes back hundreds of years, Peter the Great, the Soviet Union. Again, here's a country with an economy half the size of California's, with no appreciable military capability other than their nuclear inventory, but in the leadership's soul, it must be accepted as a great power, which is, I think, driving a lot of the activity that you see in Syria. Yes, they have a naval base that they want to protect in Syria, but just this pride of being able to project Russian influence into the Middle East is paramount to them. So again, remember that they're playing not symmetrically. Most of the Russians and most of the experts I talked to last week said, don't worry too much about an attack on NATO. Putin is too smart to get himself into a situation where he is facing, face-to-face, overwhelming military force. Don't worry too much about the fact that our ships are swapping paint in the Baltic Sea, that their planes are buzzing ours. Putin is not going to force a conventional military conflict with NATO. So he is left with these asymmetric tools, things that can be done that don't cost much, that perhaps are deniable, and that brings me, of course, to the interference in our election. And by the way, this is not a new story. The Russians have been doing this for a very long time. When they went to war with Georgia, they shut down the Georgian internet. They played around with some of the Baltic states where they actually got into networks in the Baltics and created some havoc there. And they did something very similarly in the run-up to the French election, where all of a sudden some of Macron's emails were out in the public realm. So let's just talk for 1 or 2 minutes about what actually happened, and then perhaps what we know happened and what is uncertain, and then what we might do about it. What we know happened, and it was instructive to watch Jim Comey when he wasn't director of the FBI the other day, because our intelligence community speaks very precisely. They are very careful about how they characterize what they know and they don't know, for good reasons, but also for historical reasons, when the intelligence community really got weapons of mass destruction wrong in Iraq. So you heard that the intelligence community, which is comprised of 17 different agencies, you've heard of many of them like CIA and NSA, and there's some that you haven't heard of, but came to the conclusion with high confidence that the Russians hacked into dozens, if not hundreds, of political and politically affiliated networks. The DNC is the most famous. They tried with the RNC, but they tried with any number of other political or politically related entities to use basic spear phishing attacks. This is as simple as you see on your PC every day. In an email you don't recognize, and you click that link, and the next thing you know, you've installed a piece of malware that gives visibility into what happened. So we know that they did that, and we know that they extracted a good deal of information from the DNC, from the DCCC, from a couple other entities, including John Podesta's email as part of the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then that they used a bunch of official and unofficial Russian entities, Russian-supported entities, or Russian-sympathetic entities, specifically a network called RT, Russia Today. This is a Russian government-funded television station, an outfit called Sputnik. There are a number of Russian proxy media, social media outlets that they then leaked that information to. They also used WikiLeaks, which is a whole other very interesting topic that we're going to hear more about, I think, in the coming years. But they used these channels, if you will, to put out embarrassing information. The election was rigged. Secretary Clinton, the DNC, they never gave Bernie Sanders a chance. You know the narrative that they were seeking to promote. We also know that in ways that appear to be unsuccessful, they poked around in the actual mechanics of our election. They pinged local, and I think everyone in this room knows, our elections, our federal elections in this country are still locally administered by local registrars of voters, and there is no one master system that tallies all the votes in the United States. You tally your votes in Ridgefield, and you report them to, I don't know, Hartford, I guess. I don't quite know where it goes from the municipalities. But the point is there's thousands of non-interconnected different entities out there that tally our elections. That makes them a very hard target to hack, but they tried. They tried, and I'll come back to some lessons that we might draw from that. So what may have happened? This is a Democratic DTC-sponsored event, and some of you watch me. I'm no fan of this president, and will be very critical from time to time. When I'm talking about the investigation, I really try hard to sort of, in as much as I can, remove my party jersey for the reason that we will produce a report, and this, by the way, should always have been produced by an outside commission, so that people like me who wear a party label, whatever we say will be, well, that's obviously the Democratic point of view, or when, Devin Nunes or one of the Republicans say, well, that's the Republican point of view. This is why this always should have been an outside commission rather than the two intelligence committees investigating it, but we are where we are, so again, I sometimes get, my Democratic friends sometimes get a little annoyed because I'm not willing to sort of speculate about where we end up here. But as you heard in public testimony by then Director Jim Comey, the FBI is underway an investigation into the possibility that there were links or collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. The two congressional committees are investigating that as well. And here's where we're in a realm of where we don't actually know a lot yet. There are questions that you know about, and they are just that. They are questions to which we do not know the answer. One of the categories of questions is there were lots and lots of contacts between people like Jeff Sessions, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, people affiliated with the campaign. There were lots of contacts with Russians. Now that in and of itself, of course, is not illegal. The volume of them makes you raise your eyebrow a little bit and want to understand perhaps better why the volume was what it was. What raises the eyebrow even a little further, though, is the fact that repeatedly there has been a lack of transparency, to put it nicely, about those contacts. The Attorney General had to go back and revise his testimony to the United States Senate pursuant to his confirmation. We learned that Michael Flynn had contacts that resulted ultimately in his being dismissed from his role as National Security Advisor, and the tale goes on. And again, that's conclusive of nothing other than that's odd. The other thing that is odd is the behavior of the president. He is not shy about criticizing anybody. You just need to wake up and fire up your Twitter feed to see that it could be Cutter, it could be Comey, it could be Barbara Streisand. You never know. The cast of Hamilton. Oddly, I could go on, but I want to wrap this up. Oddly, despite the fact that the Putin regime is literally murderous, despite the fact that they are countering our interests all over the world, the president is oddly silent on this one. And again, that's not illegal, but it does make the eyebrow go up, and it does obviously therefore require all of us to look into whether there was anything inappropriate about those contacts. Last point before I have just a couple of thoughts on what we need to do. What you saw last week, really kind of historic testimony, was troublesome from a lot of standpoints. I don't ever want to see this country that I love so much have, an FBI director of great integrity, and we all will have different views of Jim Comey. I profoundly disagreed with his decision to start talking about the investigation, but people will have different views. No one has ever challenged Jim Comey's integrity. They challenge his judgment, but not his integrity. So to watch in this great country, to see an FBI director with his reputation calling the president a liar, and then having the president call the ex-FBI director a liar, I don't ever want to see that again. But what has effectively happened here is that it's now put another overlay on top of everything that I just talked about, which is around the question of whether the president made an attempt to quash an investigation that could point towards the possibility of obstruction of justice. I'm using my language very carefully here because there's enough there to raise those questions. And many of you will remember that in 1973, it wasn't actually the break-in that got the president into trouble. It was the subsequent effort to cover up and to mess with the investigation of that break-in in Watergate. So again, my sort of heart breaks that in addition to Russian hack, possible collusion with Russian hack, now we've got this question of obstruction of justice, which the FBI will, much more so than my committee, will address. Last point, and I know I'm getting close on time here. Last point. So what can we do? I am a believer that then President Obama's response to the Russian hacks was sorely inadequate. You'll recall that he PNG'd, persona non grata, that's the fancy term for telling diplomats and intelligence officers to get out of your country. He PNG'd a whole bunch of Russian diplomats and covered intelligence officers. He shut down 2 facilities that they were using for espionage and other stuff, and imposed some sanctions on individuals. That had, I think, almost negligible effect on Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, sadly, is a guy who really understands in a very cynical way cost benefit. And so there is no question in my mind that he thought, wow, I barely got slapped on the wrist, we're gonna do this again. And of course he did in France, and will continue to do so probably in the German election, which is coming up. So we need a much more concerted and stronger response to this activity. And I think we've got a number of tools at our disposal that we haven't used yet. One is NATO. NATO obviously right now hangs in the balance because we don't quite know what our president thinks about NATO, and I think it would be terrific if NATO could come together and say, hey, NATO countries have been attacked. Make no mistake, this is an attack. It's not bullets or artillery shells coming across the transom, but this is an attack, and we will respond as NATO. You know, you might, I get sort of, people roll their eyes at me, but you know, I would think about an Article 5 type response. And let me be very clear, I'm not saying a military response, but we could come together and say, we, NATO, have been attacked, so therefore we, NATO, are gonna act as one in opposition. Which brings me to, what does that mean? It's hard to imagine that we would undertake what the security people call a kinetic response, a military response to meddling in our election. But we should think a little bit about that because this points to a larger security in cybersecurity, a larger question in cybersecurity. Yeah, I don't imagine that we would ever militarily retaliate for messing around in our election, but what if the Russians shut down the Florida power grid and there were 200 dead Americans because the power grid was shut down? Now you're in a world where the questions are sort of interesting. And I'll come back to that in closing. But the other point I would make is the good news is they're pretty good at penetrating networks and operating in the cyber realm. We are better. And you know, we could extract a cost in the cyber realm, which has a feeling of proportionality to me that feels pretty good. And there was, you know, I think there was consideration in the Obama administration to perhaps doing something. In fact, I heard kind of seventh or eighth hand through channels that I can't verify this is true, but they thought hard about embarrassing some senior Russian leaders, and chose not to for two reasons. Number one, once you start down that path, we don't know how it plays out. In other words, if we hack, then do they shut down a power grid? Do they try to get into our financial system? We don't know how that plays out. And secondly, you'll get a kick out of this. I think there was some acknowledgement that if you tell the Russians that their senior leadership has you know, bank accounts in Switzerland and 3 or 4 mistresses, it doesn't surprise the Russians. So anyway, that's third or fourth hand. But so it is clear we need a much more direct response. And lastly, we also need to do something soon, which is to get the uncertainty out of the system. You know, 100+ years ago, we came up with something called the Geneva Convention, and we did it with people we really didn't like. The whole point of the Geneva Convention is you work with people that you don't like so that when you're fighting those people, you're not executing prisoners, you're not doing all of the things that are prohibited by the laws of armed conflict. We need, I like to call it the ENEVA conference, a convention where we come to an agreement about things that should be off limits, and I would include you know, critical networks like the Florida power grid, but also things like election infrastructure. Until we have that agreement internationally, yes, with the Iranians, with the North Koreans, with the Russians, with everybody else, we're going to be scratching our heads about what the right response should be. So I'll stop there and thank you again for the invitation.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to start. I have 2 questions, and then we will take questions from the group, and we've got a good amount of time to do so, so I hope you get your questions answered. I have one. Scott and Jim are sitting at the table. This can go to either of you, but my question is to both of you, is there a price to be paid for the transparency of our media here in the US, as well as in the transparency of our institutions and our democratic voting process? And it's a philosophical question and perhaps also a practical one, and I open it up to whoever would like to answer.
Well, I think that it's a price worth paying for sure. And as communications devolves out, I mean, you think about in our own lifetime, I'm 51, so I remember the days when we had 3 TV channels and there were gatekeepers in the media, and you know what, that was all right from the perspective that there's reasonable, rational debate, but it was on a certain realm of the political spectrum. kind of in the middle, fringes weren't included. I think what we're seeing now because of social media and everything is we're hyper-connected, and a lot of views are out there, and information overload and some misinformation. This is ultimately going to be a test about human nature. Can we discern fact from fiction? Can we get along with people that we don't like? I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I'm optimistic, but it's going to be a challenge. But our founding fathers always believed in a free press. It was a foundational notion of the country. They had faith in us to be able to figure that out, a marketplace of ideas and so forth. Is there a price? Absolutely, there's a price. But long term, I think that positions us better as engaged, informed citizens than people hidden in the dark, which is the case in authoritarian regimes.
I agree with what Scott just said, and I would say, I'm not willing to say that there's a price. There's vulnerabilities associated with being as open as we are, but what it absolutely does, I wouldn't use the word price, it does impose a responsibility on the American citizen. I had a question at a town hall meeting in Norwalk. Somebody said, there's so much fake news out there, we don't know what to believe, lots of fake news. Can you do anything about it? And I just had a heart attack. I thought, no, you're American citizens. You do not want your government sorting fake news from not fake news. This is what dictatorships do. And the more I thought about that on stage that night, I thought, being an American citizen, look across 5,000 years of human history, what would you rather be? That's not free, right? You gotta do your work. If you love Fox News, God bless you, but spend 10 minutes, watching MSNBC, just so you get the other side of things, and vice versa, if you're on the other side of the thing. We have, as American citizens, responsibilities to develop the critical thinking ability to know when we're being fed a line and when we're being told the truth.
Okay. And I have one more before opening it up. Jim, I think you come up for re-election in 2018, is that correct? And Scott is our Deputy Secretary of State. So my next question is really going to go to the integrity of our election process and the integrity of our election infrastructure. And the committees that are currently meeting, there's a House committee meeting, the Judiciary is meeting on other matters somewhat related to this, the Senate Intelligence Committee is also meeting, and we know we have Jim Mueller has now been assigned, looking at this pattern of behavior and looking at whether crimes were committed and just what is really the case. We're staring at a very important, what's called the midterm elections, which would be 2018. We have elections that will be local as well in that period of time. So Jim, you were talking about lessons learned, and this question is really for you, and that is, what do you think about 2018? Will we have information, in your opinion, will we have information necessary to help us harden, let's call it harden our election structure if we need that? Will we have information necessary to inform citizens? Where do we go from here? And what do you think the impact is and potential steps that need to be taken for 2018?
I'm really going to hand most of that answer to Scott because he lives it day to day. You heard me say that one of the real advantages of our system is that we don't have one big network that is about our elections. We've got thousands of them, 9,000 or something different. So we've got thousands of them that are not interconnected. I really do want Scott to answer this because he understands the mechanics and the day-to-day stuff. But in addition to us doing a better job of really understanding what is fake news and what is not, so that we're less susceptible to it. And here's where I hand it to Scott. It seems to me very clear that we need at least a backup to whatever our voting machine does. Of course, we've got in Connecticut paper forms that you fill out and they get read by computer. Based on what I know now, and this is where I'm stepping on Scott's arena, we need at least a backup so that we can verify results if they're ever called into question.
Sure, thank you. So I think there are there's an important distinction and two big issues. First is that, yes, the U.S. intelligence community, those 17 agencies that the Congressman talked about, had a unanimous conclusion that the Russians tried to influence the 2016 elections. That's influence. It's not about hacking and changing the actual vote count. Now, because our system is so decentralized, how many registrars of voters in the room here today? Okay, and Peggy, you used to be one too, right? So I've visited about 30 town halls around the state already and talked with the registrars. There's no way you can hack our elections in Connecticut, I can tell you that. Because it is all decentralized, there are backups, and it is not online. Everyone should have confidence their vote has been counted. Now, have the Russians tried? They've gone into a company that does something called poll books, which is you can go to the polling place with an electronic kind of tablet that has the registration list, and that does go online, and a company that makes those, it seems, DHS didn't tell us, but this got leaked by that nice young woman the other day that might face trial, but it seems a Russian entity, the GRU, which is their best intelligence unit, tried to get into that company and set up emails to send out to election officials. So we have to be very concerned about potential vulnerabilities. The good news is we're on notice. I would recommend, and there's a call that my boss, the Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, has with the Department of Homeland Security tomorrow. She's president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. They are talking with Homeland Security officials and others to figure out, what the nature of the threat may be. I'd recommend, we used to have something called the Help America Vote Act, which was to get people registered. We need a new one for cyber, which is getting money to the states and to localities to upgrade their cyber defenses across the board in the election infrastructure. Anything else you want to know on that stuff? Peggy Reeves, stand up, Peggy, for a second. I know, I hate to point you out, but you should all be proud of her because Peggy was a state rep in Wilton. She also now is head of the elections division for the Office of the Secretary of State and is a national expert on all these issues, was just at MIT this week talking about this very topic. So I won't put you on the spot right now, but
Terrific. I think this is the time when you get to ask your questions. I will recognize you from here. Please, when you are recognized, someone with a mic will come to you, and I've asked that you state your name, where you live, and for whom the question is, okay? And please only ask the questions. And I'm going to start with the gentleman there because I saw him first. Gentleman with glasses and a purple shirt, taking his glasses off right as we speak.
Thank you very much. It was most informative to hear from you. And I wonder about...
Can you introduce yourself, sir?
I'm sorry, my name is David Franco. I live in Wilton. Any other question?
No?
Okay. I wonder if Russia, China, North Korea really wanted to destabilize the West or the United States. Would they go after our financial system, the stock market, what have you? And that would really, are we vulnerable in that area? Would you perceive that, Congressman, as a potential threat hanging over us?
Okay, so your question's for Congressman Himes.
Unequivocally, yes. And every day our adversaries that are good at this, and that includes the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and a few others. And by the way, not just countries, but to do this kind of stuff, you need, I won't quite say, what was it Trump said, the 400-pound guy sitting on his bed or whatever, but a couple of engineers, a couple of software engineers can do this. So it's not just countries, it's also non-state actors. Every day they probe not just individual banks, but the international financial system. There's a system called SWIFT by which banks and central banks wire money around. And if you saw I guess it was about a year and a half ago, an entity stole money from Bangladesh by getting into the SWIFT system. So it is a huge threat. It's maybe not quite as scary as breaking into our nuclear command and control codes, or maybe even the prospect of shutting down power grids. But it's right up there in terms of the chaos it would cause. If they were able to do it.
Okay, I'd like to take a question for Scott. Okay, we have one there. Yes, ma'am.
With this, thank you.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, I forgot, sorry. My name is Sarah Kettler. I live in Ridgefield. With the integrity of the electoral system, I understand that you're saying here in Connecticut, we are pretty protected, we have paper ballots. But across the country, you are talking about some systems that don't have paper ballots, and you are also talking about swing states in the Electoral College. You don't need to hack every system to really have a huge effect on the election. Like with the Electoral College, the 70,000 votes that decided it, you could go to just a few municipalities and interfere. And if you went to a town or a municipality that is located in a place that has voter ID laws, that if you have a middle initial that doesn't match, or if your address is slightly incorrect, you can be struck from the rolls. So it doesn't technically affect the end result of the vote, but if you're not allowed to vote at all, that is a huge interference in the election. So is there any reassurance that you can give that that didn't happen, couldn't happen, and how we would prevent it?
Thank you.
Sure, that's right. And the voter file, protecting the voter file, is of tremendous importance for the reason you're talking about. Where there could be mischief is if, for example, those poll books electronically, if they're connected in with the internet, and somebody somehow gets access and removes names, and you go to vote, and you're like, hey, where's my name? But I can tell you that's in the realm of the theoretical right now, and there's no evidence that I'm aware of. And we just had a meeting of the secretaries of state from all 50 states. I chaired the deputies meeting. This was in last February. There was no evidence or instances of breaches of the kind that you're talking about that were successful, and even it was pretty rare that there were attempts at breaches into the systems. So, I think people have to look at this. I spent about 15 years in and around counterterrorism work, Homeland Security Committee, working in the Middle East, and it reminds me of the conversations about terrorism, which we have to take deadly seriously. We also can't allow it to paralyze us, and we have to put everything into proportion. So I would say that's the case in this instance. We're on notice now, and that's the good news. And we're a decentralized system, and that is generally the good news. But we have to put more resources into making sure the instances you're talking about don't happen.
Thank you.
That's the best reassurance I can give you.
In the back, and then I'm going to take a female in the front. Gentleman with the white shirt. And please introduce yourself and where you live, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michael Andrews. I live here in Ridgefield. Thank you very much for putting on this forum, much appreciated. My question is for Congressman. First of all, compliment, very nice to see you living your words and appearing on both Fox, CNN, et cetera, engaging with people and talking. Always a good thing to say. Is there anything that can be done with the media? I don't know, whether it's political figures, working with the media, messaging, et cetera, to tone down the hyper polarization that is going on, that seems to just be ripping this country apart from left to right, top to bottom.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have thanks, Mike. I have the response, a little bit of the same response I had when the question was asked, can you help us with fake news, which is, I'm a little bit of a First Amendment absolutist, and I really, really want to keep government at every level out of the business of trying to tone down, change, evaluate anybody's speech. And I quite frankly think it's up to us as citizens. Look, I live in this world, right? You are celebrated for bombastic language. I've gotten on TV a whole lot simply because I'm in this job as the #2 Democrat on this committee that's doing the investigation. Ordinarily, they're not that interested in me because I don't say crazy things. Typically, sometimes I do. But let me see if I can give you as crisp an answer as possible. Right now in our political system, you're rewarded for being outrageous. On the floor of the Congress, Joe Wilson, President Obama's a year in, he shouts, "You're a liar." Terrible moment. And by the way, I'll be bipartisan about this. And we all hate the fact that that happened, but he raised like $2 million in the following week because he had a crew of people who celebrated that. My former colleague, Alan Grayson of Florida, goes on to into the well of the House and says, the Republican health care plan is don't get sick, and if you do, die quickly. You know, it just, Democrat, right? And, you know, I was appalled. A lot of us were appalled, and the guy raised $2 million off of that. So my point is that there's a market out there driven by what people want. And I know that this is not true of most people in this room. And one really interesting question is, how can we sort of get the sensibility that I'm so lucky that in my congressional district, I've got my fringy folks, no question about it, on both sides. But I'm very lucky in that most people in my district actually don't like that kind of language. And the question is, what can we do through our churches, our Rotary clubs, our Boy Scouts, our civic institutions to really put a value on being thoughtful and careful in the way you treat the political system that we are all very, very lucky to be able to participate in.
Thank you. The woman, CT4 invisible there, with the blue sweater, thank you. And introduce yourself, please.
Yes. Hello, I'm Gloria Rosa from Wilton, and I'm also representing ICT4, or Indivisible 4, particularly the Russia Interest Group. So we have one question for Congressman Himes, and that is, what do you think would be possibly our most effective action that we could take now? You know, we did a lot, you know, to try to get an independent counsel, lots of calls, and along those same lines, do you think it is effective to still press for an independent commission?
Effective at achieving what?
To getting a thorough investigation, nonpartisan investigation, and trying to get quickly, or maybe not quickly, but trying to get to the real answers.
Yeah, thank you. Let me be quick about this. The right answer was an independent commission, as I said before. And this is what we did on 9/11. There was a bunch of retired, you know, senators and, you know, statesmen people who weren't in the political game the way I am, and because we fight elections. So that would have been the right answer. We're not at the right answer. I will tell you though, since I'm on one of the investigative bodies, it's moving along fine. Warner and Burr are doing a great job over on the Senate side. On the House side, you saw we had a little stumble with our chairman, Devin Nunes. He went literally off the reservation. Now, Mike Conaway and I share absolutely nothing politically. That guy is as rootin' tootin' East Texas or West Texas as they come. We share nothing politically, but I think the world of him in terms of his fairness. And of course the FBI is doing what the FBI is doing. So again, not where we would ideally be, but you've got three different entities working pretty well together towards I think getting the truth.
Thank you. Woman in the back.
Hi, thank you for being here. This question is for
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Leah, and I live in Ridgefield. This question is for Congressman Himes. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what you think. You know, former Director Comey said that Russia was so successful at meddling in our elections, and they will be back. So, what do you think is the right response? Maybe not right now, but eventually, is it going to be a total embargo on Russia? Are we going to do a swift ban on them? Because since we're talking about them, and I know we've only received like a drop of what they actually did to affect our elections, and it basically amounted to a war on our democracy. So I think, what's going to be the response going forward to Russia?
I do think we have a pretty good and comprehensive sense of what they did. Again, our people at NSA and FBI and Homeland Security are very, very good at this stuff. I do think we have a pretty good sense of what they did, and I do think it's pretty careful that we understand, and Scott did a good job in saying this out. People ask, well, did they affect the outcome of the election? I don't think that anybody knows that, and it wouldn't have been because they were messing around with vote tallies. It would have been because some voter that was right on the cusp, not sure how they would go, decided because of the Podesta email that they didn't like Hillary Clinton. But nobody really knows the answer to that question. I did talk about this a little bit, so let me keep it very brief. Our response was inadequate, meaning Putin will do it again, the Russians will do it again. We need a much more robust response. It should not be military. I think it should be in the cyber realm. I would favor activity that would demonstrate our capabilities. Maybe that's making public a lot of Russian intelligence files. Maybe that's doing something that is not lethal, but really makes our capabilities clear. And we, of course, need to come up with what I was talking about before, some sort of international agreement around norms that we will all observe.
Thank you. In the front, sir, blue shirt, and then I'll get you, sir.
Yeah, hi. I'm Joe Watson from Ridgefield. Gentlemen, I appreciate your overview of the strategic situation and your comments about the security of our voting activities. But I'd like to know something more specific. I don't understand why we can have at least 3 senior members of the administration who have committed perjury, who still have their jobs, they're still getting paid, they still have top security clearances, and I guess the Attorney General got that do-over which he lied about. What is going on?
Maybe I'll just, I'll take a stab at that, because there's something that is, very serious here, which is that we're fortunate to have Congressman Himes as someone who's gonna be looking into some of these important issues. So I respect the fact that he wants to maintain, his credibility in all of this. I don't have to do that, but, but that said, the news that we have seen over the last 120 days should be disconcerting to anyone that cares about America's standing in the world and our long-term national security interests, because we are seen as a source of instability in the world at this point. Our allies are deeply concerned. And then that's just overseas. Then here at home, the rule of law and the lack of civility that's going on right now. Now, all that said, I've seen a resurgence, and this doesn't make it, it's good to have this going on, but this is a testament to something going on that I've seen all across the state, and I know it's happening all over the country, which is citizens are re-engaging in public affairs. They're standing up, they're running for Board of Education in my town, in other places, that they wouldn't have done that before. So the only way, if you go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, I went to UVA's law school, so we love Mr. Jefferson. And up on the monument, it says, an educated citizenry is the foundation of a democracy. I'm optimistic. It doesn't mean we are all angels, we are all perfect. No. In fact, it's meant for moments like this, when there are not people of the highest caliber that may be in power, that all of us rise to the occasion.
You didn't answer the question.
I think I did.
Not to my satisfaction.
I'm sorry.
So,
Let me
you got
give
any
you a
answer?
quick whack. The word perjury has a very specific legal meaning. That is knowingly lying in a context in which it matters. So if you're under oath or if you're in a courtroom, I think you're probably referring maybe to Michael Flynn, who is under investigation. If he perjured him, if he lied to the FBI or lied to anybody, there will be legal consequences. I think you're probably referring to Attorney General Sessions, the do-over. Now there's some question I saw in the news today about whether there was a third meeting. Remember, knowingly. This is why this is very hard. And look, you only need to look at my social media to know how I feel about the president and his people. But on this topic, I'd like to be a little bit careful, because someday the shoe will be on the other foot, and I really don't. I want our political system to be robust. So, anyway, I would like to assure you that if there was in fact perjury, as it is understood legally, there will be consequences for those people if the case can be proven.
Thank you very much. You, sir. And then we'll go to the back again.
Scott Benjamin in Milford, Connecticut. What do you think was the impact, and I'd like to have both speakers address it, of the president's recent trip to Europe and the relations with the European allies?
That's a 60-second answer.
Okay. Hey, we're out of the realm of the investigation. It was a disaster. He took a specific mention of Article 5, which is the core of NATO, out of his speech, and everybody knows that he did it. Apparently, I wasn't in the room. He in a room with other NATO leaders couldn't string a sentence together. This is a man who doesn't know the facts, who acts on instinct, all things that we do not, in that context. NATO is the security context that we want. The recent withdrawal from the Paris climate thing, basically the shutting down of TPP, and then whatever you think of TPP, whatever you think of NAFTA, we are saying to the world, we're no longer going to be there, and by the way, we're no longer going to lead. That's what every country in the world has heard in the last 4 months, and that's a very dangerous world.
Scott's going to answer too.
Yeah, I would say this points out something very important for a country long term, is that from the dawn of the Cold War, the executive branch, meaning the president, has accrued tremendous powers, which were not probably envisioned by the founders. And so, Congress reasserting its authority as a co-equal branch of government in the realm of national security, probably strengthening the staff that it has on all the relevant committees, being able to get answers to its questions in a timely fashion. And, I'd like to see more congressional delegations going out to our allies to demonstrate what American leadership is all about, what our values are about, and not have us say, oh gee, they spend too much money when they go out there. So, we need to demonstrate that the president does not entirely represent the United States' interests, that in fact, the US Senate, the US House, and those are both Republican controlled now. But I'm fully confident of some of those members representing us and our interests and explaining our interests more effectively than the president can.
Thank you. There's a woman in the back with a peach-colored shirt right by the mic. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Ellsworth. I'm from Ridgefield. And my question more is, every day when these tweets come out, I'm more and more shocked. So I'm just wondering, in the future of our presidency, is there ever going to be any mental health testing? I'm serious. I mean, is that legal? I mean, or will it just be that anybody with any mental conditions, or is that illegal? I'm just curious because, seriously, thank you.
So let me, having put my partisan shirt on for the last answer, let me take it off for this one. There are big things at stake here, very big things at stake, right? I mean, a properly removed president is an exercise of graceful constitutional authority. An improperly removed president is a coup d'etat. And this first really started coming up, of course, in the 1960s, when somebody asked the question, what if JFK had survived the attack that proved fatal, but had survived in a coma? There was no legal authority to appoint somebody to step in and assume the president's power. So in 1967, we passed the 25th Amendment, which gives the vice president and the cabinet the right to deem the president incapable of exercising his or her authority, or a congressionally appointed body. I want to keep this answer short. It's essentially a political question. There's all sorts of talk about, do you appoint a body of doctors? No, you don't. You don't want a star chamber. You don't want people who are not accountable to the American people through the electoral process making decisions of that consequence. This points to the gentleman's questions, the question earlier, which is actually so important in this realm. We do need to find a way to get out of this world where what is right or wrong is determined by what your party registration is. Susan, if you'll indulge me for 1 second, the best evidence I can offer to you right now is a poll I looked at the other day. One of the harder moments in my time as a member of Congress was when President Obama was asking Congress, or was going to ask Congress for authority for a pinprick, no boots on the ground strike, missile strike on Syria. My constituents at the time hated the idea, but anyway, he asked for it. And of course, then this president did that. And the interesting thing, and the reason I tell this story, is that when Obama was asking for permission for a missile strike on Syria, 22% of Republicans supported it. 85% of Republicans support exactly the same thing when Donald Trump did it. And we just need to get away from that if we're ever going to have some confidence in how such a process might actually be in the interests of the country rather than the interest of a party.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. Gentleman in the green shirt, yellow. And then I'm going to get you in the back, sir. Okay?
Hi, my name's Chuck Jennison. I live in Ridgefield. My question really is about the environmental situation. And what I'm seeing, which I find encouraging, is a lot of cities, a couple of states, are taking their own position on or pulling out of the Paris Accord. And I'd be curious to know your perspective on that, Congressman Himes. How does that play out legally within the government, the federal system? Thank you.
Yeah, let me be quick, because I think the topic is there's others probably with questions on topic, but it's an important question, and it points to something that Scott said, which is, great thing about our country is that we're not, this is an ancient Rome with one, Caesar, right? when the president decides something, states can decide other stuff. Businesses, universities, municipalities can decide other stuff. So as a result, as you point out, it's wonderful to see the state standing up and saying, we're actually going to abide by our Paris climate obligations and whatnot. What is sad is, again, I understand why Americans want to focus on home. I do too. I represent Bridgeport, Connecticut. I represent 95 through here. I want to focus on home. But sadly, that doesn't mean ignoring problems that really can only be solved if we work with other countries. But your point is exactly right. One of the great things about this country is the president can decide something, and if the states and municipalities and people decide something different, his powers are very, very limited.
Okay, I'm gonna go to, the young man in the glasses beard right there.
My name is Josh Spencer. I'm from Danbury, Connecticut. You guys were talking about, specifically you, Congressman, you were talking about 17 intelligence agencies, and the loyalty pledge is one of my big issues right now. And Director Comey was very forthright about everything he knew, everything that went on with President Trump. But the two men the day before is actually what has troubled me the most up to this point, and it was Director, trying to remember here, Coates, and yes, thank you. Those two men who were so lack of forthright. And my bigger concern is really the agencies that are looking into everything that's been going on. It's the lack of forthright from multiple intelligence agencies. So I was wondering if you could talk to me about how confident you are that all of these agencies could actually work together looking into the hacking moving forward, not just the looking into what actually went wrong with the president.
Yeah, I can be pretty quick on this. The agencies have worked together really, really well to lay out what happened in the hacking. And there's an unclassified report out there that you can read. There's a much larger classified report behind that. That was the product of the entire intelligence community. They did a great job. They continue to do a great job monitoring things like the French email stuff. So they do a great job in that regard. Coates and Rogers was very puzzling to me. This is when they said we're not going to disclose private conversations for two reasons. Number one, there'll be different legal opinions on this question. I'm not even a lawyer, but smart lawyers tell me that the obstruction of justice case is not yet made. But if, in fact, the president said to both Coates and Rogers, I want you to stop this investigation, it gets pretty close to made, and they chose not to answer that. The other concern is it procedural. You can't not answer a question to the Congress of the United States. You can claim executive privilege, which they did not do, and in fact probably waived, because they characterized those conversations. They talked about it. So Adam Schiff, who's the top Democrat, and I think Mike Conaway, we are going to get to the bottom of whether those conversations occurred or not.
Thank you. I've got a couple of quick things for the group here. Before we conclude, obviously our speakers are not only highly qualified, they're sober, they're just, they're intelligent. All right, sober, just, and intelligent. Not for long. All right, good. Saturday. Why not? I want to make a point, and it brings us back to the purpose of these forums and to the compliments we've received from Congressman Himes and from Deputy Secretary of State Scott Bates. There is something about being in a position where your service is to the country and your service is not to party. I think Rudy Marconi, our first selectman, is everyone knows he's a Democrat. We love you for that. But Rudy always puts service to the town of Ridgefield long before he will ever put service to the party. Let us think about that when people in public service do not only work for the government, there is a great deal of government bashing, infrastructure bashing. Oh, Washington is bad. Oh, Hartford is bad. Okay? But people who are in public service do not only work for the government, they work for the people of the United States. They work for the people of Connecticut. And their primary obligation is to the public. It is in forums such as this, it is in your voting booth, it is in your neighborhood, it is in your desire to stand up, be heard, and make a point, and frankly run for office, which I will speak on in a second, where we are mutually responsible and accountable to each other. That is what being part of a community is, that is what public service is. These two gentlemen demonstrate that admirably and to the highest level of service. And that is what a forum such as this is all about. I am going to quickly introduce Tom Madden to stand up. He is our chairman of the Democratic Town Committee. We are looking for candidates. We are looking for candidates. We're looking for candidates to run as Democrats in the municipal elections coming up in November. See this gentleman, please. If you have an interest, and if you don't want to run this year, maybe you want to run in 2018, because there are state rep seats, state senate seats, and others that are coming available in 2018. It is only the engagement of the citizenry that keep us safe and secure. With that, I would like to thank most heartily our Congressman Jim Himes, our Deputy Secretary of State Scott Bates,